On today's episode of Locked On Wild, let's take a look at what the Wild have available for trades.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, we are your team each and every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day as well. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Built Rewards. Start earning points on rent you're already paying by going to joinbuilt.com/lockedonnhl. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we take a look at what the Wild have available as we move closer to the trade deadline. Take a look at the draft pick situation for the next few years, as well as the prospects that are the untouchables in the Minnesota Wild organization. And we'll take a look at how the Wild are going to navigate the salary cap situation. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild and credentialed media member of the Minnesota Wild. And you can use this to kind of pass the time between the first and second intermission here tonight. The Minnesota Wild playing a late one against the Florida Panthers. And just wanted to take a look at some of the particulars. You know, with the way that this Wild team is playing, seems pretty likely that they may be looking to make a trade deadline acquisition to try to bolster, in particular, the top six from a scoring perspective. So wanted to just take a look at what is available for the Minnesota Wild to deal in trades. Now, the move earlier this year to acquire David Jiricek from the Columbus Blue Jackets ate into a little bit of the draft capital that the Minnesota Wild have available, but they still do have a second, fourth, fifth, and sixth round pick in the 2025 NHL draft. And it is interesting, too, that Bill Guerin was willing to trade away that first round pick this year, as it seems like there are more and more reports that this draft class is just not as strong as the last few have been. And that if you are looking to really make a splash in this year's draft, you're trying to get into the top four. Beyond that, you know, there's nobody that really separates themselves from the pack. So no first or third or seventh in this year's draft for the Minnesota Wild. 2026 gets really interesting, though. The Wild have a first-round pick, a second, a third, a fourth. They have 2 fifths and 2 sixth-round picks, and a seventh. So they had a couple of additional third- and fourth-round picks that have since been moved, but still plenty of capital from the 2026 draft that the Wild could dangle if needed. And then in 2027, the Wild have a first, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, and a seventh. So draft capital-wise, this is the first time in Bill Guerin's tenure that he has traded away a first-round pick. So every year that Bill Guerin has been the GM, for the most part, the Wild have kept their first-round selections. This was the first time that the Wild have traded one. And before this, I believe the highest pick that had been traded by the Wild was a second-round pick in the Marc-Andre Fleury trade back a couple of seasons ago. Other than that, it has mostly been lower-level picks or prospects that Bill Guerin has used to get most of his trading done. Sometimes you have situations where you have Jordan Greenway available, and you ship him off to Buffalo, and you get a second and a third-round pick in return. So there are ways to recoup picks in addition to sending them out to pick up whatever it is that you need. Let's take a look at this as well. You know, if we discuss what this team really needs at this point, I think it's pretty safe to say that we would all be happy with a little bit of a second or a little bit of a top 6 scoring upgrade. The defense is in pretty good shape now with everybody back except Jake Middleton. So you've got, it feels like you've got bodies to cover at this point. And when Jake Middleton does return, you've got a couple of guys in Declan Chisholm, and you've got the recently acquired Travis Dermott too. It feels like that gives you a little wiggle room on the defensive side to be able to handle any sort of injuries as we navigate down the stretch. You've got plenty of bodies to fill the bottom 6 in terms of injuries for this Minnesota Wild team. But it just doesn't feel like you've got anybody that you could slot in to that top 6 and say, okay, this is a guy that we feel like can really put us over the top and can allow us to contend with the Winnipegs, with the Vegases, with the Dallases. It feels like a top 6 scoring piece would really put them over the top. And I don't know. I would say that's probably the most critical spot to fill, which is interesting considering how the penalty kill has been all season. Maybe if you could get a little bit of help with that. But let's think about this. Would you rather have somebody fill a roster spot that can give you goals on a more consistent basis? Or would you rather have somebody that can maybe help the chances of a successful penalty kill by like 5 or 6%? I'd rather have the goals if it were me. So if it comes down to needing to fill one roster spot, go get the scoring. Go get the scoring to complement the goaltending and the defense that have been rock solid for a large majority of the season. There will be guys that'll be available. It just is part of the process. It takes a while for these sorts of things to materialize. You see the sporadic trades here and there. Earlier tonight, Capo Caco traded to the Seattle Kraken, right as we talked about whether or not there was interest in him from a Minnesota Wild perspective. You see a trickle of moves. It seems like there are some teams that do like the reactionary trades to try to save the season early on in the year if they're taking on water. As we get closer to the trade deadline, we will certainly see that activity increase and then some. Just had it in the Discord server. I do believe the trade deadline is in March 7th, 2025. So that will be the date that you'll see a lot of moves made by as teams try to bolster their chances to make a run this year. And call me crazy, but it feels like this is one of the years to do it with there are a ton of quality teams, especially in the West. Obviously, Winnipeg has been at the top of the standings for a large majority of the season, but it feels like they've fallen back to the pack. And Vegas has been pacing the Pacific Division for quite a bit of the season, but there's no teams that really jump out at you as this is a legitimate, this is the favorite, this is the runaway favorite. So why not bolster a little bit to try to put yourself a little higher in the conversation? Minnesota Wild have been one of the best teams in the West for pretty much the entire season. Can't take that away from them. But you could vault them up to the top and say, oh my God, this Wild team, they got some legit scoring now to add to this mix. They might be the ones to beat in the West. It feels like of all the years where you are maybe trying to leapfrog some teams that are definitely above you. I think of 2 years ago when Philip Gustafsson won the Vezina, or should have been one of the finals for the Vezina, where he was just an outrageously good goaltender. The Wild were playing good defense. They didn't have the scoring to really match those teams that were above them in the standings. They did enough to be a playoff team, but they were distantly back from the pack from a like contenders pretenders perspective. This year it feels like they've got the defense, they've got the goaltending. If they can get somebody to slot in and really inflate that top six, those can push them ahead of some of the other teams because Kirill Kaprizov has been on this just outrageous heater. You have Matt Boldy getting off to a really, really good start. His numbers have come back down a little bit, but he's still there as an option. Somebody that can kind of be that middle ground between those two, that would really put you in a good situation to make a potential deep run in the West, depending on what happens with those special teams. So it feels like there is some good precedence for a trade for the Minnesota Wild this year, but there are some tricky issues to navigate, including the current roster situation, which is preventing the Wild from a key piece that could help them out in the trade department. We'll tell you about why the Minnesota Wild currently are not accruing any cap space on a day-to-day basis. That's on the way as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Select Quote. The World Series, the Super Bowl, the Olympics. The world's top athletes get to play in these top-level sporting events thanks to one thing: teamwork. And teamwork can also protect your financial legacy and your family's future. Select Quote's licensed insurance agents are the perfect teammates when shopping for customized, affordable life insurance. They can find you the right policy to keep your financial legacy safely in your family's end zone. Select Quote is one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, helping over 2 million customers find over $700 billion in coverage since 1985. If you're in good health, they work with carriers that could get you same-day coverage for up to $5 million, no medical exam required. Get the right insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/LockedOnNHL. Again, go to selectquote.com/LockedOnNHL today to get started. That's selectquote.com/LockedOnNHL. Today's episode of Locked On Wild also brought to you by Built Rewards. If you're a renter, listen up. This is a total game changer. Thanks to Built, you can now earn points on rent payments just like you do with groceries or travel. Paying rent now comes with serious perks, and it is completely free to join. Earn valuable Built points on your rent and everyday spending at no extra cost. Redeem points towards flights, hotel stays, and even future rent payments. With over 500 airlines and 700,000 hotels in their program, the possibilities are endless. Access unique experiences that are exclusive to Built members. One of the things that is most enjoyable about Built is they make it easy to turn your rent into rewards. If you're already paying rent, why not make it work for you? Start earning points on rent you're already paying by going to joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNHL. That's joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNHL. Make sure to use our link so they know we sent you. Don't wait. Head to joinbuilt.com/LockedOnNHL and start earning rewards today. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, no postcast tonight as it's a late one, just underway between the Minnesota Wild and the Florida Panthers. But we will have you covered as the weekend unfolds. We'll recap the action for you tomorrow with John Hines' Three Things. So be on the lookout for that right around lunchtime for tomorrow's episode. Let's get back into the trade primer. I know we're super early in the process, but you know we're starting to think about some things that could potentially help this team as they move through the season, get a couple of key pieces back healthy. And one of the things that I think is important to note is earlier in the year, before all the injuries, The Minnesota Wild are in position to have as much as $10 million available at the trade deadline because of the fact that the salary cap accumulates on a daily basis. All the roster juggling and the roster moves were potentially going to leave the Minnesota Wild with a good deal of room to be able to go out and get somebody who could make a big difference. That, however, is not the case anymore, as due to Jake Middleton being on long-term injured reserve, when you have players on LTIR, you do not accumulate cap space on a daily basis. So what it does offer you is the ability to go over the cap for roster moves and acquisitions. The only thing about that for the long-term injured reserve, magic cap, as I guess we call it, the pool, is that in order to bring players back off long-term injured reserve, your cap balance you need to be under the cap to be able to put a player back on. Unless that player is out until the postseason starts, and then there's no salary cap in the playoffs, and you can just activate them whenever you please. Just ask Tampa Bay and Vegas how that works. And the situation being, like, if it was a player that maybe wouldn't give you a big boost, then maybe you could say, well, we don't necessarily need them back per se. But Jake Middleton, I think, is important enough that when he's ready to return, you want to get him back on the roster. And so that would lead to that LTIR pool being evaporated pretty quickly. As of right now, as of today on Puckpedia, the Minnesota Wild's currently projected to have $1.154 million in deadline cap space. So there's a little wiggle room there, but it doesn't offer you a ton, especially if you're looking at getting players that are making somewhere around $5-6 million a year. That doesn't leave you a ton of room. Now, obviously, by the time the trade deadline rolls around, you're taking on a prorated portion of that contract, at least for this year. So this is where the retained salary comes in. This is where holding on to a portion of the salary could come in massively for whoever the Minnesota Wild try to go out and get. And that's where you have to potentially pony up a little bit more to make it worth the team's while to hold some of that salary on the books. Each team gets 3 slots to hold on to either retained salary or the buyout slots. The Wild have 3 retained salary slots remaining, because those Parise and Suter contracts are in a different category due to the buyouts. If, let's just say for an example, let's say the Minnesota Wild found a buyer for, I'm just going to use him as an example, just because the math will be easy. Let's say the Minnesota Wild found a buyer for Marcus Johansson at 50% retained. Because Marcus Johansson's only on contract for this season, the Minnesota Wild would use up one of those retained salary slots for the rest of this year, and then that slot reopens. So you have to keep that in mind as well for whatever team the Wild are looking to make a deal with. Since Brock Nelson is the one that has the most steam, I'll start with the Islanders. They have not used any of their salary retained slots, which is good news. The Islanders are in a mess of a cap situation themselves because they currently have a couple of players. They've got Anthony Duclair on long-term injured reserve, and so they're not accumulating cap space either. But they got a little bit of cap room right now, so that's something to keep in mind for later on down the line for when a trade comes about. Now, another team, just because it's fun to speculate, the Buffalo Sabres, they have not used any of their salary retention slots either. So you wouldn't really run into an issue unless you go to a team like, I don't know. Why do I feel like San Jose has a bunch? Yeah, San Jose has used all three. They're retaining salary on Brent Burns, Erik Karlsson, and Tomas Hertl. Yikes. So all of their slots are currently occupied. Now, the Brent Burns retention comes off the books after this season. Oh, but they're still retaining. They'll be retaining on Tomas Hertl for like 5 more years and Erik Karlsson for 3 more years. But the point is that if you don't have cap space, there are ways around that. You can have the team that has the player that you want retain a little salary. You could also have a third party come in and broker the deal, like the Minnesota Wild did for Ryan O'Reilly to Nashville. You could have a team broker the deal, and they get a draft pick for taking on some salary. So even though the Minnesota Wild's not going to have as much cap space as they would have by dipping into long-term injured reserve, there are ways around that. And the prospect pool is big enough that you can part with a piece without really having to worry about getting into any of the top players in the prospect pool. So let's finish today's episode by looking at one key element. Who are the untouchables in the Minnesota Wild organization? We'll talk about that as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Prize Picks. If you love sports, you are going to love Prize Picks, the best place to turn your sports knowledge into real money. Whether it's hockey, football, or any of your favorite sports, Prize Picks makes it easy to get in on the action. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. Plus, this holiday season, they are giving away $30+ million in rewards during Pixmas and offering 2 free picks in December. And when your picks hit, Prize Picks makes it easy to cash out. You can get your money in as fast as 15 minutes. This week on Prize Picks, I am taking a look at a few hockey automatic picks. Looking at Jack Hughes for more than 4 shots on goal and Artemi Panarin for more than 1 assist. It's so simple to make my picks and have fun with friends while potentially cashing out fast. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly at Prize Picks. Run your game. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Again, hopefully you're enjoying this episode in between periods in tonight's game between the Wild and the Panthers. No postcast tonight, but we will recap the action for you tomorrow. We'll get some thoughts from John Hines, and hopefully the Wild are able to pick up another solid win against an Eastern Conference contender. Who of the Minnesota Wild prospects would you consider untouchable? There are certainly a few, but I want to talk about some things that have really kind of changed my feelings about the Minnesota Wild D core and subsequent D prospects. So your D core right now, and they're not going to play forever, but Jared Spurgeon playing at a high level, Jonas Brodin playing at a high level, Jake Middleton was playing at his best level ever before injury. So there may be some concerns there about how he looks when he comes back. I'm not super worried about that, but it is something to at least keep in the back of your mind. But then you have Brock Faber. You've got Zeev Buium. You now have David Jiricek added into the mix as far as prospects of the future that have, I think, vaulted up to the top of the list as far as D prospects go, because these Wild defensive prospects, it feels like we've been waiting forever. Granted, they are still only 21, 22 years old, so they're still figuring it out. kind of where they slot in, how they fit in, what they do out on the ice. So they're not finished products by any means, but I feel like you've got replacements in waiting for Spurgeon and Brodin with Buium and Jiricek. They don't bring the same things, so I'm not suggesting that it's a perfect swap scenario. But you've got long-term placements waiting with Buium for sure. Hopefully for Jiricek. The hope is that he pans out and is able to slot into that decor without any problems. But then you got Faber taking up a spot. Declan Chisholm has played really, really good to the point that maybe you look to re-sign him too. Feels like the D side of things is getting a little crowded. And you still have Jack Pert, Kyle Masters, Carson Lambos, David Spacek, Ryan O'Rourke, still down there, still marinating, still percolating. And on the offensive side of the equation, you've obviously got Kaprizov, you've got Boldy, you got Eriksson Ek, you got Matt Zuccarello for one more year. You have waiting in the wings, Liam Ogren, Danila Yurov, Riley Height. You've got some names that you hope are going to be able to slot into that top six. But here's the other thing to consider. If you're getting a guy to take a top six spot, that is one less spot that's going to be available, especially if you get somebody that you then could try to sign and add into the equation a little bit. So I would say the Untouchables, and of course Jesper, still the heir apparent to the goalie room. Although Philip Gustafsson, if he continues to play like this, they can sign him to an extension, and that would not upset me in the slightest. So who are the Untouchables? Jesper, number one. Easy. Like, he's not going anywhere. After that, I would go probably Zeev Buium is another. And I'm talking like you're not even having a conversation about those players. Now, I know there's kind of the flip side. I think it's been brought up in the comment section a little bit as to if this is how Philip Gustafsson is going to be, do you really need a goalie prospect to, do you really need like a franchise goalie prospect to play behind him? And I still say yes, because that allows you to not have to throw all of it on Jesper right away. So I still would say, that you keep Jesper and you acclimate him to life as an NHL goalie, and then you've got two really good goalies that can take that goalie room and just take a ton of the starts off the table. So Jesper, Zeev Buium, I would say, because they just acquired him and they paid a hefty price to get him, that David Jiricek isn't going anywhere. Beyond that, on the offensive side, I think Riley Height is probably the most untouchable, but I don't put him in the same category as Jesper, Buium, and Jiricek. I feel like those are the true untouchable, not going to have a conversation about those guys. Those are the tried and true untouchable prospects. I think you would have to really be, you'd really have to be wowed, obviously, to move some of the other guys. Like Liam Ogren, obviously, you're not going to throw into this type of a trade. The one that's interesting, but because you have not, you haven't signed him to his ELC yet, is Danila Yurov is kind of an interesting one, because he's waiting for his spot. Do they keep Do the Wilds carve one open for him next year to be able to slot him in, or does it end up being a situation where, well, we're going to have to wait and see? They're just, it's a point that bears repeating regardless of where you think these prospects are. Not all of these players are going to make it. Not all of these players are going to get to the NHL level with the Minnesota Wild. They just won't. You hope that more of them pan out than don't, but the percentages just... Some of these names that the Wild have drafted that we even think are going to be really, really good just won't pan out. That's just how the situation goes as human beings who take information in differently, who react to coaching differently, who have different ideas as to what is a particular fit and scheme for them. Like the human process is just different on a case-by-case basis. So the Wild may think that they have a perfect system to acclimate particular players into it, and the player just is like, no, not for me. Jack McBain, for example, didn't want to wait for a spot to open up here, so he asked that he be traded. It happens. The key point, one that I picked up this year that is just, it is absolutely true, and I do this too in coveting prospects and picks, and not wanting to see them traded away for seemingly short-sighted moves. If you have a window as an NHL team, if you have a window that you feel like you are legitimate contenders, a prospect 5 years down the road may not help you. It doesn't matter if it's a top prospect or if it's somebody that you feel like can slot into your middle six. If your window is right now, that prospect may not be able to help you achieve that goal. And so what you need to do as a franchise is when you identify that you are in your window, and I'm speaking generally. I'm not necessarily saying that this is the start of the window for the Minnesota Wild. I'm just saying in general, when you identify, hey, we're going for it, anything that does not help you immediately achieve that goal should be on the table. That sounds crazy, but think about it. Anything that doesn't help you, because if you're the Minnesota Wild, if you make a deep run, how much is a first-round pick in the late 20s going to help you out, especially in a weak draft class? Not a ton. If you have a D-core that is rapidly starting to fill up, is a potential third-pairing prospect that isn't developing at the best rate going to help you out? No. So what you do is any of those picks or prospects that aren't going to help you achieve your now goal, and I'm not saying you trade all of them at once, but if there is an opportunity to make an improvement now that you feel like would be a surplus later, those are the opportunities that you should take. So it all comes down to where the Wild are at, and more importantly, where the teams that the Wild are looking to do business with are at as the season unfolds. Right now, the only teams that are really super out of it are the Buffalo Sabres, who have 26 points. And if we look at the playoff standings, they are 15 points out of a playoff spot right now. In at least in the divisional side. On the wild card side, they are 8 points out. That's kind of daunting for a team that's lost 11 in a row. Montreal Canadiens are probably in a similar spot, as are the Columbus Blue Jackets. Those teams are probably definitively out of it right now. The Detroit Red Wings are 4 points back. They've been just brutal this year, but there are expectations on them to win. So until they fall 10, 15 points back, they're going to continue to push. On the Western Conference side, the Calgary Flames are in the final wildcard spot with 36 points. San Jose, Anaheim, Chicago are all teams that we just do not expect are going to be in a playoff spot. Like they had no playoff aspirations at the start of the year. Nashville is 12 points out right now, and they have the fewest points in the entire NHL. So they're probably cooked. But these are all the teams that are within like 4 or less points. Seattle, St. Louis, Utah, Colorado. On the other side, the teams that are within 4 points or less: Detroit, New York Islanders, New York Rangers, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. So there are a lot of teams that are still within striking distance, which is why over the next probably month and a half, right up until the Four Nations face-off, that is make or break time. That is going to determine which of these teams are in the mix and which of the teams fall out of it and are sellers by the deadline. So mitigating injuries for the Minnesota Wild and just continuing to kind of grit their way through this, grin and bear it. Once they get key pieces back, see who is out of the playoff picture by then and see if you can get something done. But the Wild definitely have assets to move. They have ways to maneuver, not a ton of cap space available. The opportunity to make a deal exists for the Minnesota Wild if they find the right dance partner. That'll do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. We will have a recap of tonight's game against the Florida Panthers for you coming up tomorrow, probably just after lunch. So make sure to stay tuned for that, and make sure to enjoy the rest of your night and week. We've got new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.